welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this happy Thursday afternoon. Welcome to Supply Chain Information Flow. I am your host, David Johnson, and on behalf of ISM New Jersey, myself, and the 60-degree weather in New York City, I'd like to welcome you to Supply Chain Information Flow with my guest today, Sheldon Mydat from Suppeco.
Hey guys, David, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. Please, as is always the case, I try to make this as interactive as possible. I want everyone to have the opportunity to ask Sheldon questions and harass him because he is a bona fide expert in the field of supplier relationship management. We sit in a unique space, the way things are going right now. With our organizations as procurement people, we've got long-term contracts that we're kind of stuck in the middle of, and margins are going down and suppliers are pushing back on every little thing. And we now have to find ways to grab value when there's not much value to be had. And with that in mind, I want to talk to Sheldon. I want to give Sheldon an opportunity to talk about what he and Suppeco are doing in the space to help procurement folks like ourselves carve out a little bit more of that value from our existing supplier relationships. So Sheldon, thank you for coming on the show, and I'll give you a few minutes to talk about yourself and your wonderful twins and all that other stuff.
Thanks, David. Like I said, appreciate coming on the show. It's great to chat. So yeah, I've been around the track a few times. I've been in the industry for about 25 plus years in supply chain and supplier management, working in the enterprise space with organizations that were going through divestment or supplier transformation programs or merger acquisition, etc. Big outsource deals, usually enterprises, multinational companies. And the theme was always the same. It was, well, we want to drive value out of these engagements, out of these relationships as we go through these large changes. And for me, it was all about, okay, so we've got these big contracts. We want to move them from place to place, and we need to keep the lights on, and we need to track that value and drive as much value from the relationship space as we can. And there wasn't really any spreadsheets to do what we were doing over all these years. It was always spreadsheets and PowerPoints, to be honest with you. How do we use spreadsheets to emulate this kind of subjective behavior, everything that happened up in the relationship space? This is away from the contracts, away from those predefined margins, up in the relationship layer, that woolly subjective space that was called SRM in the old days. And it was pretty much deferred in favor of a more addressable, a more spend managed approach, because that was addressable. And so CPOs would kind of defer the relationship approach, because they'd have CFOs invariably wanting to know where the money is, and the CPOs would challenge their category teams to say, what is going on with our suppliers, our supply chains. And the answer would be, well, here's our de facto, our predefined contract margins of 10 to 15% that you have, invariably within those contracts. And then the next question would be, well, what about this SRM that you guys are talking about? Well, we've got to nurture these relationships, et cetera, and it takes time. And a purist procurement approach years back would be very focused on the category spend, and the supply chain itself was invariably seen as an overhead. And as is the case with any overhead, the emphasis is going to be on driving costs down. So you've got some big challenges there. And it was like that for a very, very long time. And to be honest with you, it's been like that. It's been a challenging place, driving value from the relationship space with so many challenges. But COVID happened, I'm going to bring this right up to speed here. COVID happened, and it kind of broke supply chain. Let's face it. But before that, you've got the likes of McKinsey that were studying and releasing these studies that went back 20 years that said, hey, you've got a disruption curve that looks like this. So disruption is not a new thing, but there was nothing that really, really challenged the norm of the day. And so nothing really changed. COVID obviously broke. It was a knockout blow. It changed a lot of things and really was a wake-up call. And more and more companies are looking to do something different. It helped, I'd say, by the likes of McKinsey and Gartner and Hackett Group and Forrester and IDC and any of these other companies that are out there saying, hey, COVID, knockout blow. There are more and more procurement and supply chain professionals out there that are going to be focusing very heavily on relationship-driven resilience. And there are more and more CPOs out there that are saying it. It was the CPO, the global head of procurement at BAE Systems, that said it to us early on. Coming off the back of COVID, turbulent times, we're going to need to find other ways besides contract management to meet our value targets. Because in a recession, if we are indeed in a recession, arguable. Okay, I think we are. Contract margins shrink, business shrinks. So if you're looking at a predefined margin of whatever, 10 or 15% and 20%, that margin is going to diminish as your business diminishes. It's just simple economics. The only thing that doesn't shrink are the value targets. They're up here.
Yeah.
So the requirement is so the challenge is, well, how do we meet those value targets? And the answer, as we know, is to look up into the relationship space rather than down into the numbers. So all of this stuff is happening, and I've been doing this for years, and suddenly it's coming out in waves now, and it's a real kind of come to Jesus moment, to be honest with you, for me. I've been saying this for years, and it's happening. It's coming to fruition.
It's got to feel good though when you think about it. Like, you've been living this life as an evangelist for supplier relationship management for a while, and then you see the Hackett's and the Gartners and these guys all putting out, Deloitte as well, putting out CPO priorities for the last 3 or 4 years, and right at the top of that list is supplier relationship management, right? So let's look at defining for everyone here what supplier relationship management is in the context of Suppeco.
Yeah, absolutely, and you are right. It's not just the analysts out there. It's Big Four as well. Deloitte are a big one. Absolutely, they're famous for putting out these CPO flash surveys at the end of the year, etc. So you're absolutely right. And yes, SRM is generally one of the top 2. I think it's the number 1, maybe 2 on the top 10 priorities for most organizations now. So it's really come of age. But it's not a new thing though. So if we look at the definition, the early definition of SRM, it's Peter Krauge, working for McKinsey at the time, early 1983, defined it as proactive improvement of supplier engagement, on the part of the corporate buyer. So evaluating supplier performance, looking at determination of contribution from the different parties from the supplier, and the definition is still true now, but with some differences, because times change, challenges change, and SRM in the early days did tend to become quite adversarial. Very much so. It wasn't really supplier performance. It wasn't really SRM. It was supplier management. It wasn't really a relationship management.
It's performance management.
It was performance management. There was no relationship, playing a part anywhere. And it was very adversarial because it was all about, percentage point reductions, et cetera, and as I said, challenges, attitudes change, things evolve, and especially now with the amount of disruption that's going on, and short supply as an example, things have to change, right? So the message overall is the overall definition might be the same, but it's matured. It's now very much about emphasizing a collaborative relationship engagement. Because
not necessarily just point reduction anymore, right? What are the some of the other things that that your clients are looking to get aside from just, hey, let's take some cost out of this agreement? What else are they looking?
So spend management is still very important, clearly very important. But first of all, it's guarantee of supply is one thing. Okay, before we get into the innovations and the different collaborations, it's the thing that focusing on becoming a customer of choice by driving good relationship with your supply base means that by fostering these relationships and collaborating with your suppliers, they're likely to consider you rather than considering the competition. Because if supply is short, you've got two customers that require the same thing, one supplier providing it. The organization that's fostering the best collaborative kind of a relationship and trade-off for a supplier is going to get the business. It's as simple as that, in simple terms, because suppliers are investing as well. They really are.
Yeah.
And so very heavily, so these collaborative relationships are very, very important, and that's how the definition of SRM has changed, in my view. It's now about being collaborative and driving that relationship, and so there are different things that customers look for. Number one is guarantee of service, but looking along the top line for things like fostering innovation, for example, improving the way things are done, shared R&D, reduction in TCO, different things that you'd expect to foster through becoming a customer of choice, for example. So if you are working as a preferred customer, then you are going to receive your supplier's investment. You're going to receive their attention. You're going to get their A team for a start.
Yeah. So you keep using the term customer of choice, which is an amazing term, and I love it. Do you have any experience of a journey from a not customer of choice, a transactional relationship, to an organization becoming the customer of choice for one of their suppliers? Like, what does that journey look like? Do you have an example of something like that you can share?
One of our customers, BAE Systems, their mission was to become the supplier's customer of choice, and there is a case study out there that talks about that journey. And for them, it was very much about moving from a position of transactional engagement to a position of equitable access for their supply chain, so they could foster better relationships. They could give their suppliers a voice, give them ownership, give them a platform with which to critique and provide a narrative. So they didn't want to just be in a position where they were assessing supplier contribution and supplier activity or performance, but they wanted to be able to create a narrative as well. So rather than just flagging KPIs and alerts, very important to them to actually create a narrative so that they could see where they themselves needed to improve. And it was only by creating that narrative that they could actually start to see a journey of improvement. Because just by having KPIs flag up, it doesn't necessarily give you a journey of improvement. It just gives you warnings.
Yeah.
It's only when you create the collateral, the narrative, that you can actually see the improvement. You can actually see where innovation, exercises or programs of innovation are paying off. And there was one example with BAE Systems in the manufacturing space, where one of their suppliers was in the assembly process was innovating in the way that they attached chips to wafers. And the innovation of the improvements therein were passed through as part of an improvement program to the customer. Now, that wasn't being done as part of the goodness of their hearts. It was being done as part of shared R&D and the trade-off that provides in terms of creating a longevity in the relationship, a more strategic relationship. So yeah, that's one very, very big, and we have a few examples like that where shared R&D features very heavily in these relationships.
So we've got a definition of supplier relationship management. We've got this idea of customer of choice. Most organizations have hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers, right? I know my last place, when I started, we had 1,100. When I left, we had 450, right? Had to boot people. How do we identify the suppliers that we should commit this extra effort to become a customer of choice? Because you can't be customer of choice with 400 suppliers, right?
No.
How do we figure that out above and beyond contractual obligations, right? How do we get to that group of suppliers we want to be customer of choice with?
So it's interesting on you look at the contract management position, as you say. There are certain things there are many considerations in this space. Number one, segmentation, obviously, in order to identify who are your, whether it's emerging or critical or strategic or whatever. Different companies define their contracts or their suppliers in different ways. But things are changing. For a start, number one, as I said, you've got to, in terms of the value from those contracts, you've got a 10 or 15%, maybe more, de facto margin. And you could say that keeps the lights on. Okay. Now, for some of your more transactional arrangements, there's not going to be very much heavy lifting, okay, beyond a contract in traditional terms. But in others, you're going to find a lot more MSPs, for example, managed service providers. Those types of organizations vary in nature, but they are inherently about driving value through innovation. That's their purpose in life, right? That's what they do. They're SIs. So they are typically the kind of area, the kind of suppliers that you expect to foster better relations above the contract line, as you say. So, but I would say the relationship layer needs to be understood carefully, needs to be understood fully. Okay, the relationship layer is, and this goes back to what we were saying about SRM of old, this kind of woolly subjective area that was deferred in favor of a more addressable spend management approach. It was always in the past a bit like nailing the kind of proverbial jelly to a wall, but it was human driven, human behavior driven. That's one of the things that needed to change. So one of the things we changed on Suppeco was to create an infrastructure within the relationship layer. Okay, driving value from the relationship layer. Let's look at some statistics. Okay, relationship strategic value from these relationships. If you're talking about executing strategic objectives, 91% of companies out there fail to deliver against their strategic objective executions. 60% plus of organizations fail in digital transformations. Okay, they don't fail because of challenges down in the systemic data, linking systemic data, or in the logistical functions. They don't fail because of those challenges. Now, they are challenges and they are complex areas, but in the grand scheme of things, these failure rates come from issues within the relationship layer, higher up where we as people live. And at the end of the day, we don't live inside a contract. We live in the operational. We don't live inside a legally drafted contract that works to clause. Contracts are there, they go in the drawer. We live and we innovate up in this relationship space. That's where the stuff gets done. But as I said, historically, very hard to do because there's no structure. Now we've created structure. We've created an infrastructure that allows organizations to pinpoint and work down into at a level of real precision to execute their strategic objectives or tactical operational objectives. That's been missing until now. It's a very, very important area, because, you know, when, as you said, if you're talking about these strategic relationships, or the type that we want to have relationships with, okay, fine, we can decide who they are, but then we've got to work with it. We've got to figure out how we're going to execute and actually become successful at doing it, and that has been very, very challenging until recently.
It is very, very challenging. Tiffany asked, how do we overcome those relationship challenges that you spoke about?
Well, let's put it this way, okay? If you're talking about relationships, what's the currency within a relationship? The currency in a relationship for me is trust, okay? So if trust is the currency of relationships, then that trust can go up or down in value, depending on how you, I was going to use the word, maybe abuse that trust, or fail to deliver within that relationship, which is going to hit on your, you know, those trust levels. And trust is not always about everything going right, by the way. Trust is about how well you manage things when they're going wrong. That's true trust, because not everything's going right at the moment, believe it or not. So, so trust, what does that mean? How do you overcome? You overcome with visibility. Okay, you overcome by providing visibility within a relationship, an equitable place for your partners to come together. Okay, so customers say to us, we've invited suppliers onto the platform, and they've come back and they're a little bit dubious about coming back and critiquing, or you know, critiquing us as a customer on things that are going wrong, because they feel it's going to harm their position. But in actual fact, it works the other way around, and we find that customers want that of their suppliers. They want to they want to foster those relationships where suppliers can put their hands up and say, this is wrong, because that fosters trust. That's how you drive a collaborative relation. That's true collaboration at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, your supplier have a wide variety of customer relationships, so they should have seen whatever it is that you're trying to do at least once in the past, and they should have lessons learned or best practices about how it can be done, right? Theoretically.
Yes, they do. They do, but it's always come down. In the past, it's come down to the low-hanging fruit, or what's more addressable. Now, as you said earlier on, you know, as you both kind of touched on, you know, when inflation goes up and things get tight, you're kind of forced to recognize certain things and to try something, and to focus on those relationships, because that's what's going to get you through. And the companies that don't foster those relationships, they're going to struggle. They really are, because that's the direction of travel. You know, this year is going to be difficult. So is the year after, and potentially after that. You know, if you don't focus on those relationships, on driving trust, driving equitable, you know, collaboration, and it's going to be a bumpier ride, existentially, in my view.
That's true. That's true. We're looking to build. This is, everybody in here is procurement, right? So I can say this,
yeah, of course,
openly. I would say it anyway, even if there were people who aren't procurement, because, you know, everybody knows me that I'm just that guy, right? We live in relationships where we have to build partnership with someone who kind of has a goal that's the exact opposite of what we want. We as procurement people are judged by how little we pay for a product, whereas salespeople are judged by how much they can sell it for. How do you reconcile those two sort of opposing challenges to build a relationship where we can create value for both organizations?
It's a very interesting question. I think there'll always be the traditional.
I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, Sheldon.
No, listen, it's the right thing to do. Okay, so I think value is the new imperative. Okay, it's not, you know, it's not about, you know, spend management. It's about value. It's about the value imperative. How do we drive value? How do we drive longer term value We want to save, we want to save $50 million is still very much out there, and it's still very much top of the pile, but it's not the only thing at the top of the pile. Okay. And there are different ways to get to the $50 million. Okay. And it's not going to be the same route it was, because there's not enough money left to do that. Not in the same deal, because because the same approach, the old approach was to focus on those contract point reductions in order to kind of get our set. Those days are done at the moment. Okay, we need to find other ways to do it. So it's about the value imperative to get us to the same point. And think about it, right? So if you've got, look at this, to give you an example, you might be familiar with the Gartner slide. It's been copied thousands of times, but the Gartner slide is kind of a table, an axis that looks like this, with a year one or day one to year 5. Okay, the contract is let at day 1 and runs to year 5, and hemorrhages value, and then is relet, and then you've got a line running up the middle that says this has been contract managed, and that's your 10 or 15% pre-negotiated margin. That, in my view, is about keeping the lights on. And then you've got this relationship line that hockey sticks up, and that's north of 25% or upward of 25% over term. This is the additional value creation that comes from shared R&D, thought leadership, collaboration, et cetera, that currently hemorrhages over term because of poor relationship management. Okay, so we've got a situation where procurement, and it is procurement, okay, still, but it's an evolving procurement, because procurement are changing and they are reskilling, they are recognizing that they need to kind of take a few rungs up that ladder, because the lower ground is being automated. It just is, by tech. Just a tiny little caveat, a little kind of segue on that. The reason it's automating so much in the lower ground is we talked about supply chain being being an overhead, and the emphasis being on cost reduction, as it is with any overhead. And we talked about purist procurement, taking a numbers driven approach. So you take those two factors and you look at the supply chain, and you think, well, what's the product market fit in that space? Well, it's numbers driven, so it's essentially heavily weighted in the S2P end of the life cycle, spend management, et cetera. So, and then you got purist procurement that traditionally worked very happily in that space. Things are changing, the different challenges and disruptions that we've been talking about, and you're now looking at a new product market fit within the supply chain space, because they're now looking at how to drive value from their relationships, which is giving rise to new types of technology that we've seen coming through. So yes, you've got the $50 million saving target. It's coming through value creation rather than point reduction. That's what I'm saying. And we've now got the tools to help us create a substantive, hard-coded position. And I actually think that the savings and the value creation that we can see from the relationship space is increasingly going to be hard-coded into those annual targets. It's not going to be a nice to have. It's going to be hard-coded, because the technology is enabling us to hard-code it. So it's depended on, it's becoming critical. And this is the change I see happening.
So
it's a long-winded answer to a short question.
No, it's a good answer to a difficult question. In your BAE example, the partnership between the BAE sourcing team and their supply chain was probably, their supplier was probably the typical thing, right? I'm going to tell you exactly what I need to tell you in order to get my order placed.
Mm-hmm.
During that journey from transactional to strategic partner to customer of choice, how did the information sharing change? Like, how much did BAE open the books to their suppliers to give them that forewarning, that new information that allows them to be proactive, right? To actively pursue and actively chase that reduction in TCO, that innovation for BAE.
So it's a combination with BAE or any of the other companies that we engage with. The emphasis is on creating an equitable experience for suppliers. So rather than just making suppliers accountable for things, and this isn't BAE, this is just generally, rather than making suppliers accountable, you give them ownership as well. Because if you're going to make them accountable, give them ownership, give them some entitlement, give them some. I'm not suggesting that I don't mean in a contractual, risk profiling and giving them more. I don't mean in that sense, but I mean in terms of giving them access and giving them a real feeling of derived contribution. We do it using our platform by creating this equitable space that supply chains come together and within this kind of infrastructure, and a real kind of omni-channel experience for entire supply chains to come together in a very controlled and channeled way, and the level of visibility that creates pays off in a big way. Let me give you another example. If we talk about, there's different types of value and different types of needs. Okay, so if we talk about ESG, big area. Now let's look at supply chain. 43% of companies in supply chain are smaller companies, and those companies have 43% of those companies. So the further you go along the supply chain, the smaller the companies tend to become, and the smaller companies, 43% of them have zero visibility of their produce, the product, once it leaves their premises. Right. So from an ESG kind of standpoint, that's quite troubling. Obviously, 6% of organizations have. Only 6% of organizations out there have full visibility of their supply chains, but 43% of them are smaller companies and they have no visibility of their produce. And aligned to that, this is pretty important. EcoVadis did a study that showed that out of 100% of the suppliers that they surveyed said that the CSR clauses that they drafted into supplier contracts were absolutely meaningless. They had no place in reality at all. They were just general clauses, and they were trying to impose them into contract. You can't do this stuff by imposition. You've got to do it through having a relationship. And the smaller companies out there are struggling. The big companies out there are struggling. Don't get me wrong. It's tough out there. But the smaller companies are saying, what is this stuff? What's in it for me? What's in it for me? You can't impose it. The way to do it, and this is where it comes back to relationships, you have to have relationships with these suppliers. You have to invite them in, invite them onto the platform, give them voice, give them visibility. It's very important to do that anyway, because the new legislation that's coming out in the US and Europe, etc., the compliance against that is 24/7, and whistleblowing is on the rise. So, and with the public and its insatiable urge to take, public workforce, insatiable urge to take their complaints straight to social media, that's a reputational situation for companies.
Yeah.
And so, again, the legislation is obviously going to be applied at the end customer view. They're the most visible entities, but they may be ultimately accountable, but 80% of their revenue lives outside their borders in their supply chains. And it's those companies that are saying, what's in it for me? They're the ones that ultimately have to play their part. So how do you do that? You need to bring them in. You need to have a relationship with them. You need to give them a voice. And that's been shown to be effective rather than imposing these things. So that's another area of value, by the way, very important area of value creation, that's kind of strategic or longer term value creation. So because if you say
it's more of a carrot versus a stick kind of thing, right? Instead of I'm imposing these mandates on you, now it's like, here's how I'm going to help you become more of a valued partner to me.
and they're still kind of being, they're still being contracted, they're still there.
Yeah.
But there's ways of doing things. If you simply impose it, then it's not going to happen. If you, the emphasis here is on having a relationship, a meaningful relationship, the where you're able to understand the impact of having that relationship. Very important.
I mean, we are walking around this idea. You talk about the relationship layer, and you talk about how becoming a customer of choice. And we've even talked about building trust a little bit in a relationship. How does Suppeco as a platform enable us, these procurement and supply chain people, to give us that visibility into our supply chain, to give us that opportunity to build transparency and trust with our suppliers and our downstream suppliers? Because we may not even know who all of our downstream suppliers are, because we don't have visibility into the full length and breadth of our supply chain.
That's true. It's most likely that we don't actually. If we look at the statistics, it's true. We don't see beyond level 2, 1 or 2 at best. How do we do it? So we've created a collaborative space that looks deep into supply chain, and we've created this infrastructure space that enables the right people to see the right data. But we've done it in a way that doesn't require them to all log in and look for their work and look for the project spaces and the workspaces. And the platform is about creating this infrastructure for a collaborative engagement, or different types of operations and service lines, because obviously they're all different, and to create a community within all of the different workspaces where all of the different stakeholders within the communities that can come together to actually see, contribute, feedback, score KPIs as well. This isn't about, putting stuff out there for your suppliers to see. This is about putting stuff out there for your suppliers to join in on, to score KPIs, to contribute, to comment, to talk, to upload information. It's a very collaborative experience, with a big C, and that's how we do it. That's how we do it. So there are some cornerstones of what we do, that are very important, because let's look at the typical operation nowadays, on a global scale. So you might have one country waking up, another country going to sleep, distributed teams, remote functions, multiple service lines, operations, several languages, and that is just the customer. Now overlay against that the supplier operations, the supplier layer, and all of its interactions. You have a highly dynamic, never stopping operation, non-stop operation. So how do you manage relationships and data within such a dynamic place? First of all, you can't do it with spreadsheets, that's for sure. This is not going to work. And PowerPoints and God knows what else. You need digital technology, true collaboration technology that can cope with that kind of dynamic, highly complex, in real time, because these things are non-stop. As I said, one wakes up, another goes to sleep, etc., etc. So you need something that can ebb and flow with that entire kind of operation, and that's what we created. So there are a number of cornerstones that are needed to make something like that work. Number one is the infrastructure within the relationship layer. Okay, that's really, really important. The ability to create structure, because once you create the structure that allows you to go down into precision, you can measure, you can manage, and then you can measure, and then you can drive value from it, and improvement. Number two is something called actionables, which is something that digital platforms need to be able to do. And there's another McKinsey report, actually, another McKinsey study that talked about this really great paper called Shifting the Dial in Procurement, which is still a great paper. And it talks about companies that use digital platforms like ours, but it doesn't have to be ours, are able to vacate. They're able to affect an additional 3 to 10% annually, incrementally on an annual basis, because they do everything in real time. So you look at KPIs like reduction in TCO, for example. Time to action.
Yeah.
You can radically reduce time to action because everything's done in real time. You don't need to work to a legacy governance regime. Not only that, time on task. These are two very key KPIs in this space that can be hugely affected by using a digital platform that does everything in real time. So that's actionables. The ability to see and the ability to do out in the field and drive improvement. Number 3 is insights. The ability, we only use live data on the platform. Very, very important in today's operation that you only use live data, because data is a very valuable commodity, but it ages very quickly. And things are changing very, very quickly now. So we need to be on top of it. And the other one is Omni. If you're going to do this for the kind of operation I've described, then you need to create an omni-channel environment where entire communities can come together in a very controlled, channeled way. And the 5th one is automate.
Yeah.
This is another thing. There are too many platforms out there that end up as shelfware. Because you create this banging software and it sits there waiting for people to use it. So the data becomes old, ends up shelfware, sitting in the archive. So we thought, well, we're not going to be a passive platform. We're going to take all of the data that we create and all of the data that's just created by the community across the operation, and we're going to distribute it out, push it straight out to all the different stakeholders and communities on a weekly basis, so that we keep the plates spinning. They don't have to go looking for the data follows them. Very, very important. And these are principles of engaging in today's operation. It just so happens that we've applied them within our software, but they are very, very important principles that are needed for today's complex environments.
I can definitely co-sign the issue of stale data as a person who had to build SRM with a series of spreadsheets and every month worrying about customer satisfaction scores and then tabulating and all of that stuff, and only to go to a QBR and have some other issue come up that was not reflected in somebody's response. So it's a platform like this with real-time collaboration, with the ability to consistently gain feedback from a 360-degree kind of feedback mechanism would be very, very valuable across in my work. And really quickly, I have a question that came in the Q&A. When SRM with a strategic supplier is left in the hands of one buyer, can you recommend strategies to increase departmental engagement within the relationship?
So I kind of need to unpack that. So if we're talking about SRM with one buyer or with one seller, was that with one supplier? With
one supplier, and one buyer.
Okay, so one buyer I get. Obviously, if it's one customer, one supplier, well, I would, platform or not, just with my kind of procurement hat on, I would personally suggest absolutely introducing some commercial tension into those situations, because it depends what they are as well. If it's a supplier that is providing something that is very hard to come by elsewhere, then it's a I was going to say unique situation. It's not so unique now, because things are not on the shelves as they used to be, right? They're just not. We see it all the time. It's a very different place now. Bit of a legacy to COVID, clearly, and all the other stuff that's come to fruition. But I would absolutely talk about how we can see you can do so much in order to break down the supplier relationships, to really understand how they tick and how they work. There's so much you can glean from looking at the data and the cadence of that data, the cadence of these relationships, and you can do that side by side with different suppliers on the platform to obviously see how they, understand the commercial tension in those seller buyer situations. But I would absolutely say, so if it's a single source, I would absolutely double down on really understanding some of the metrics in that proposition, to understand them. And you can do that with data, you can do that with barometers and KPIs, etc., etc. But you can also look at different cadences, different types of engagement cadences in the relationship, because bear in mind that one buyer, one seller, there can be some complacencies that creep in on both sides, on the buyer or the seller side of that engagement, and it's very important to be. It's interesting. So one of the big areas on the platform, it's called relationship utilization cadence. Bit of a mouthful, but it's a process where a set of algorithms that we use on the platform to we take all of the data, everything we do on the platform is live, right? So we use a set of algorithms to, number one, quality stamp the data and to date stamp the data, because as I said, data gets on. We use that to drive our automations out, for a start. But what we also do is we use it to gauge the value of the relationship layer, the cadence of the relationship layer. Everything gets a score, and we can see where the engagement is dropping, where the plates are starting to drop within that relationship. So we get all these kind of meter scores that show us. And the reason I say it is because suppliers are generally more adept at collaborating than customers, because suppliers do it with lots of customers, whereas not so much now, but in years gone by, the customer was always right? Not so much now, but there's it's still a very, very interesting source of data, because you can really understand, you really glean from that where the engagement cadence is starting to flag, and then you can drill into that area. You can look at the data. So it's very, very interesting. Another long answer to a short question. Apologies.
It's okay. It's okay. We have a few minutes left. I want to give anyone else an opportunity to ask questions, and I want everyone to please put into the chat, Sheldon, how anyone can contact you. We're gonna work on a showcase, I think, where we give you an opportunity to show the Suppeco product. I think there's a lot of value that can be had given the nature of our relationships with our suppliers, right? We're all in long-term relationships, good, bad, or indifferent. Some of us are at the point where we're about to break up and are trying to figure out who's going to move the furniture. And some of us are still in that honeymoon stage, but we all have opportunities to garner more value, to co-create value, and to build out our relationships in different ways. And if we have a platform that can give us full visibility into our supply chain, give us that one channel to keep our strategic suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers in the know, to the way that we're going to do things, and to the way that we're going to grow these relationships and nurture these relationships, I think it's all to the good, and it will help us to meet our annual targets and get those big bonuses and raises that we're all hoping for.
Absolutely. Yes, it says value targets are being derived from different value sources now, and that's the key thing. We're looking to a different treasure pot to find those goods, to find that value, and I think that's only going to increase. Personally, what's the future, I think, of the relationship space? I think we're going to be finding, not there yet, but I actually think that with the direction of travel, the relationship layer is going to become so hard-coded in the level of confidence going to drive that expectation, and you're going to see it turning into more of a contractual approach even.
Yeah.
But the problem is with that, obviously, if you turn the relationship layer into a contract, you're going to stymie all of the creative activity that lives in that space. So you've got to be careful not to do that. Leave that in the contract. But the contract just sits there as a foundation, and we build a collaborative relationship on top of it, and that's the key.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sheldon, for your time. Please put your contact information in the chat for everyone here to see. We are, yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. And we will definitely have a showcase where we show Suppeco to everybody here and everyone who's interested. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Cheers, guys. Thanks for your time.